What does Russia truly see when it looks at America? Not the Hollywood image, not the democracy it promotes, but a rival, sometimes feared, sometimes envied, sometimes despised, whose power has shaped every corner of Russian foreign policy for over a century. From the Bolshevik Revolution to the war in Ukraine, Moscow has never stopped watching Washington, and Washington has never stopped watching back. This is the story of how Russia reads American power and what that reading has meant for the entire world. The birth of suspicion, 1917 to 1945. Long before the Cold War had a name, Russia and America were already practicing its rituals. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, Washington's reaction was immediate and hostile. President Woodrow Wilson did not congratulate the new Soviet government. He sent troops. Between 1918 and 1920, American forces joined the Allied intervention in Russia, landing in Archangel and Vladivostok as part of a multinational effort to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution in its cradle. The intervention failed. The Red Army survived. But the memory of foreign soldiers on Russian soil fighting to undo the revolution seared itself into Bolshevik political consciousness with permanent force. Lenin himself understood America not merely as a government, but as a system, the most advanced expression of capitalism the world had yet produced. In Leninist theory, the United States was the apex predator of global imperialism. It was also, paradoxically, something to be studied and emulated in matters of industrial organization. Lenin famously promoted Americanism in the Soviet factory system, the efficiency of Taylor's scientific management, the assembly line genius of Henry Ford. The Soviets did not hate American productivity. They hated the class structure beneath it. They wanted the machine without the owner. For 16 years after the revolution, Washington and Moscow did not even maintain diplomatic relations. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet government until 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt finally opened formal ties, largely for commercial reasons. American firms were already doing quiet business in the USSR. Ford had sole manufacturing technology. General Electric had provided electrical equipment. Even as politicians denounced Bolshevism, industrialists followed the money. This pattern, ideological hostility masked by economic entanglement, would repeat throughout the 20th century. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, everything changed overnight. The wartime alliance that followed, known to the Soviets as the Great Patriotic War Coalition, briefly made Washington and Moscow partners. American Lend-Lease deliveries, trucks, aircraft, canned food, boots, communication equipment, poured into the USSR through Iran, Alaska, and Arctic convoys. Soviet generals would later acknowledge that the war effort would have been far more difficult without this material support, even as official Soviet historiography long minimized the American contribution. But beneath the surface of wartime cooperation, suspicion never fully dissolved. Stalin was convinced, not without reason, that Britain and America had delayed the opening of Second Front in Western Europe deliberately, allowing the Wehrmacht to bleed the Soviet Union white before Anglo-American forces would have to fight. The D-Day landings came in June 1944, 3 years after Barbarossa. By then, 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. In Moscow's accounting, this was not merely a military decision. It was a political one. The capitalist powers had watched and waited while Soviet blood paid the price. American power, from Moscow's earliest vantage point, was therefore never simply military or economic. It was also strategic, patient, calculating, and deeply self-interested. The Soviets entered the post-war world with this lesson already learned. They would carry it into every negotiation, every summit, every proxy conflict for the next half-century. The wartime partnership produced its own specific anxieties. American industrial output was staggering. The United States in 1944 was producing more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, and more artillery shells per month than any nation had ever managed. Soviet planners watched these statistics with a mixture of admiration and dread. If this was what American capitalism could mobilize in war, what would it do in peace? The answer, they feared, was dominance, economic, political, cultural, that would leave no room for a socialist alternative anywhere on Earth. Stalin's approach to the post-war settlement reflected this fear precisely. He did not want merely to rebuild Soviet territory. He wanted buffer states, an entire belt of friendly governments between the USSR and the West. He wanted Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia inside the Soviet orbit, not because he particularly valued those populations, but because he valued the strategic depth they provided. American power was the variable he was managing against. The Red Army's presence in Eastern Europe was the only guarantee he trusted. By the time Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman took office, the wartime coalition was already showing the cracks that would become its permanent architecture. Truman was blunter than Roosevelt, less willing to accommodate Soviet demands, more suspicious of Stalin's intentions. His administration would soon be shaped by men, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, James Forrestal, who viewed Soviet expansion as a direct threat to American interests and to the liberal international order Washington intended to build. The stage was set. The alliance was over. The competition was beginning. What Moscow took from those years was a specific theory of American power, that it was vast, that it was self-interested, that would use every available tool, military, economic, political, and ideological, to shape the world in its own image. This was not paranoia. It was a fairly accurate description, and it would guide Soviet, and later Russian, strategic thinking for generations to come. Empire and ideology. The Cold War reading of American power, 1945 to 1962. The atomic bomb changed everything. On August 6, 1945, the United States destroyed Hiroshima with a single weapon. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had known the Manhattan Project was underway. Soviet intelligence had penetrated it deeply, but the actual deployment of the bomb was still a shock. Not a military shock. Japan was already beaten. The shock was political and strategic. Truman had demonstrated something that no amount of diplomatic language could conceal. The United States now possessed a weapon of absolute destruction, and it had shown no hesitation in using it. Stalin's immediate response was characteristic. He showed nothing in public. In private, he accelerated the Soviet nuclear program with furious urgency. Lavrentiy Beria was placed in charge. Resources that a ruined country could barely spare were redirected to the project. 4 years later, in August 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly was over. But those 4 years, in which the United States was the only nuclear power on Earth, shaped Moscow's understanding of American strategic intention in ways that would never fully heal. From Moscow's perspective, the post-war American approach to the world was not the spread of freedom. It was the construction of an empire, more sophisticated than the British or French models, but an empire nonetheless. American bases ringed the Soviet Union from Western Europe to Japan. American money rebuilt Western economies through the Marshall Plan, binding them to Washington's political framework. American corporations penetrated markets from Latin America to Southeast Asia. American cultural products, films, music, consumer goods flowed outward in a tide that Soviet planners found as threatening as any army. The Truman Doctrine of 1947, which committed the United States to supporting free peoples resisting subjugation, was read in Moscow not as a defense of democracy, but as an offensive ideological weapon. The declaration of American intent to intervene wherever communism threatened to expand was, from the Soviet view, a blueprint for global intervention. George Kennan's famous Long Telegram and the subsequent X article, which laid out the doctrine of containment, confirmed Moscow's fear. The United States had designed a strategy specifically to prevent the Soviet model from spreading, and it was prepared to sustain that strategy indefinitely. Korea brought the theory to practice. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, American troops were under fire within days. Stalin had given cautious approval to Kim Il-sung's offensive, calculating that the United States would not intervene strongly for a remote Asian peninsula. He was wrong. The Korean War killed millions and ended in stalemate, but it demonstrated something crucial to Moscow. America would fight anywhere to prevent a communist takeover. The ideological commitment was real. The military capability was enormous. The willingness to sustain casualties, at least for a time, was genuine. Soviet strategic thought in this period was shaped by a fundamental asymmetry. The United States had allies. NATO, formed in 1949, bound Western Europe to American security guarantees. The U.S. had overseas basing, hundreds of installations from Britain to the Philippines. The U.S. had a blue water navy capable of projecting power to any ocean. The U.S. had nuclear bombers that could reach Soviet territory. The USSR had nuclear weapons and the Red Army. But it was geographically enclosed. Its allies were dependencies more than partners, and its economy, though recovering, could not match American industrial output. This asymmetry produced a specific Soviet response: the cultivation of revolutionary movements in the developing world. If American power could not be matched directly, it could be bled indirectly through proxy conflicts, support for liberation movements, and the cultivation of anti-American government from Cuba to Egypt to Vietnam. The Soviets did not invent anti-Americanism in the Third World. They found it already present, rooted in colonial grievances and economic exploitation, and they watered it carefully. Nikita Khrushchev, who consolidated power after Stalin's death in 1953, brought a more theatrical approach to the confrontation with American power. He was the first Soviet leader to visit the United States in 1959, a barnstorming tour that included a famous trip to an Iowa corn farm and a frustrated visit to Disneyland. Security concerns prevented entry. Khrushchev was genuinely impressed by American consumer abundance. He was also genuinely competitive about it. His famous kitchen debate with Vice President Richard Nixon, conducted in a model American kitchen at a Moscow exhibition, was a performance of Soviet confidence, but underneath, it ran real anxiety. Could the Soviet system actually produce living standards to match America? The answer, as the decades would reveal, was no. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought Moscow's reading of American power to its sharpest, most dangerous focus. Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba for several overlapping reasons: to deter an American invasion of Cuba, to correct the strategic imbalance created by American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, and to demonstrate Soviet resolve after the humiliation of the Berlin Wall. When Kennedy imposed a naval quarantine and demanded removal of the missiles, Khrushchev faced the full weight of American power directly: naval, nuclear, diplomatic, and political. The resolution of the crisis was actually a negotiated compromise. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. The Americans quietly removed their Jupiters from Turkey and pledged not to invade Cuba. But the public narrative, heavily shaped by American sources, portrayed it as a Soviet capitulation. In Moscow, this reading ranked. Khrushchev's colleagues never forgave what they saw as the public humiliation of the socialist camp's leader. He was removed from power in 1964, in part because of it. The lesson Moscow drew from the Cuban crisis was not that nuclear confrontation was too dangerous to risk. It was that the USSR needed to achieve genuine strategic parity with the United States in nuclear warheads, in delivery systems, in conventional forces, before it could negotiate as an equal. The massive Soviet military buildup of the 1960s and 1970s flowed directly from that conclusion. American power had to be matched. There was no other way to be taken seriously. Détente, defeat, and the collapse that changed everything. 1963 to 1991. By the mid-1960s, Moscow had developed a sophisticated, layered reading of American power. It was enormous, but not invincible. It was ideologically motivated, but also commercially flexible. It could be checked through nuclear deterrence. It could be exhausted through prolonged proxy warfare. And, crucially, it was subject to domestic political pressure in ways that Soviet power, at least officially, was not. Vietnam proved the point. The American escalation in Southeast Asia, which reached its peak in 1965 to 1968 with the introduction of over 500,000 U.S. troops, was watched from Moscow with intense interest. The Soviets supplied North Vietnam with surface-to-air missiles, MiG fighters, artillery, and advisors, carefully enough to avoid direct confrontation with the United States, but substantially enough to ensure the war could not be easily won. When American television brought images of the Tet Offensive into living rooms across the country in January 1968, and when public opinion turned decisively against the war, Moscow drew conclusions that would shape its thinking for decades. American power was constrained by American democracy. Public opinion was a vulnerability. Domestic division was a strategic resource to be cultivated. The period of détente that followed, roughly 1969 to 1979, represented something genuinely new in the Soviet-American relationship. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger believed that the United States, facing Vietnam exhaustion and relative economic decline, needed to manage its competition with the Soviets rather than confront it everywhere. Leonid Brezhnev, who had replaced Khrushchev and was presiding over a Soviet Union at the peak of its military power, was ready to talk. The result was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I and II, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and Nixon's 1972 visit to Moscow, the first by a sitting American president. From Moscow's view, détente was not a change in the fundamental nature of the competition. It was a phase. The Soviets continued arming client states in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia throughout the détente years. When the opportunity arose to support Cuban forces intervening in Angola in 1975, Moscow took it. When Vietnam fell in 1975, Soviet officials privately celebrated, not because they loved North Vietnam especially, but because American prestige had been grievously wounded. The limits of American power had been exposed for the entire world to observe. The 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the decision that unraveled détente permanently. In Moscow, the invasion was defensive in intent. The Soviets feared the collapse of a friendly communist government on their southern border would destabilize Soviet Central Asia and open the region to American and Chinese influence. But the outside world read it as Soviet expansionism, and the Carter administration responded with fury. Grain embargoes, boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and, crucially, the covert arming of the Afghan Mujahideen through Pakistan's intelligence service. The CIA program, Operation Cyclone, would eventually funnel billions of dollars in advanced weaponry, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, to the Afghan resistance. Ronald Reagan, who took office in January 1981, represented something qualitatively different from any American president Moscow had previously dealt with. Reagan genuinely believed the Soviet Union was an evil empire. He said so publicly in those words, and he believed American power, properly mobilized, could bring it down. His military buildup was massive. Defense spending rose from roughly $134 billion annually in 1980 to over $293 billion by 1985. New nuclear deployments, Pershing II missiles in West Germany, cruise missiles in Britain, brought American warheads closer to Soviet territory than ever before. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in 1983, threatened to negate Soviet nuclear deterrence entirely, though its technical feasibility was always doubtful. In Moscow, Reagan's presidency generated something close to genuine alarm. Soviet military planners in 1983, during the Ryan intelligence operation, designed to detect signs of an imminent American nuclear strike, became convinced that the United States might actually be preparing for war. The NATO exercise Able Archer 83, which simulated nuclear release procedures with unusual realism, sent Soviet intelligence into a near panic. It was one of the closest brushes with accidental nuclear war that the Cold War produced, and it was largely unknown in the West for decades. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary in March 1985, came to power understanding that the Soviet system was in structural crisis. The economy was stagnating. The Afghan war was draining resources and morale. The technological gap with the United States was widening, not closing. He needed time and reduced tension to reform. His approach to American power was therefore fundamentally different from his predecessors. He wanted genuine agreement, not merely managed competition. His willingness to accept asymmetric arms reductions, giving up more weapons than the Americans, shocked the Soviet military establishment. His decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, completed in February 1989, was an acknowledgement that the USSR could not sustain indefinite military commitments in unfavorable terrain against CIA-supplied opponents. The collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe in 1989, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all in the space of months, was met with Soviet non-intervention. Gorbachev had explicitly told Eastern European leaders that the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle that the USSR would intervene militarily to preserve communist governments, was dead. When the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, and Gorbachev did not send tanks, the Soviet Empire in Europe effectively ended without a shot fired. American policymakers were astonished. They had not expected it to happen so fast. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in December 1991, when Gorbachev resigned and the Commonwealth of Independent States replaced the Federation. From Moscow's perspective in the years that followed, this was not the natural conclusion of a discredited system. It was a defeat administered in part by American strategy. The Reagan military buildup, the Afghan war, the ideological pressure, the economic competition, all had contributed. American power had, in the end, outlasted Soviet power. The question was what would come next. After the wall, Putin's Russia and the reckoning with American unipolarity, 1991, present. The 1990s were, from Moscow's perspective, a decade of humiliation. The Soviet Empire was gone. The Russian economy collapsed. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Life expectancy fell. Organized crime seized large sectors of the economy. And throughout it all, American power was at its unchallenged zenith. what French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine called, in 1998, hyperpower. The United States was simultaneously expanding NATO eastward, bombing Serbia without UN Security Council authorization, and lecturing Russia on democracy and human rights. In Moscow, these were not the actions of a partner. They were the actions of a victor administering the terms of a defeat. Boris Yeltsin's Russia tried, for a period, to work within the Western-led order. Yeltsin himself had warm personal relations with Bill Clinton. Russian troops briefly joined NATO operations in Bosnia. There were discussions of Russia eventually joining NATO, discussions that went nowhere because neither side was truly committed to them. The fundamental problem was that Western institutions were designed for Western interests, and Russia was too large, too different, and too proud to accept a permanent subordinate role within them. Vladimir Putin's ascent to power, Prime Minister in 1999, President in 2000, marked the return of a specific Russian strategic tradition, the conviction that great powers compete, that weakness invites exploitation, and that American declarations of universal values were a disguise for American particular interests. Putin had come of age in the KGB, the institution most devoted to studying and countering American power. He understood the United States with a professional's clarity, its strengths, its contradictions, its domestic vulnerabilities, and its strategic patterns. His early overtures toward cooperation were genuine, if conditional. After September 11, 2001, Putin was the first foreign leader to call President Bush with condolences, and he offered Russian intelligence cooperation against al-Qaeda. For a moment, a different kind of relationship seemed possible. Then came the Iraq War of 2003. Russia, France, and Germany all opposed the American invasion, which proceeded without Security Council authorization. The unilateralism of American power, its willingness to act without international consensus when it judged its interests required it, confirmed everything Putin believed about Washington's real intentions. The color revolutions deepened the rupture. The Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, all produced pro-Western governments in post-Soviet states, and all were read in Moscow as products of American democracy promotion programs, NGOs, foundations, and diplomatic pressure designed to reshape post-Soviet political space in Washington's image. Whether or not this reading was fully accurate, and Western governments insisted they were merely supporting civil society, it produced real strategic consequences. From Putin's perspective, the United States was attempting to deny Russia its sphere of influence, to encircle it with hostile governments, and ultimately to replicate in Russia itself the kind of regime change it had promoted elsewhere. Georgia in 2008 was the first open military confrontation, when Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, encouraged in part by ambiguous American signals, attempted to retake the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia by force. Russia responded with a military operation that drove Georgian forces back in 5 days. The war demonstrated that Russia was willing to use force to defend its perceived interests in the post-Soviet space, and that American rhetorical support for Georgia would not translate into military intervention. Moscow read this correctly. There were limits to American commitment. The Arab Spring of 2011, and particularly the NATO intervention in Libya, accelerated Moscow's confrontational turn. Gaddafi's overthrow and violent death, enabled by American, British, and French air power under a UN resolution that Russia had abstained from, rather than vetoing, convinced Putin that Western commitments to responsibility to protect were a tool for regime change against leaders who defied Washington. He would not make Gaddafi's mistake. He would veto future resolutions. He would rearm more seriously. He would expand Russia's military presence in Syria, which became a laboratory for rebuilt Russian military capacity beginning in 2015. Ukraine became the defining confrontation. The 2014 Maidan Revolution, which ousted the pro-Russian President Yanukovych after months of street protests, was read in Moscow as an American-backed coup. The leaked phone call, in which Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland discussed which Ukrainian opposition figures Washington preferred for the new government, seemed to confirm Moscow's analysis. Russia responded by annexing Crimea, the first forcible annexation of European territory since World War II, and supporting armed separatists in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. Western sanctions followed. NATO deployments to Eastern Europe expanded. The relationship between Russia and the West entered a structural hostility from which it has not recovered. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 represented Putin's most consequential gamble on his reading of American power. He believed, or allowed himself to believe, that American resolve was weakening, that European dependency on Russian gas would fracture NATO solidarity, and that Ukraine could be subdued quickly before a coherent Western response materialized. He was wrong on all counts. American military and financial support for Ukraine exceeded what most analysts had predicted. NATO cohesion held, and indeed strengthened. Finland and Sweden both joined the alliance, adding to precisely the encirclement Moscow most feared. Yet Moscow's analysis of American power has not fundamentally changed. It sees Washington as determined to preserve a unipolar order to prevent any challenger from accumulating sufficient strength to contest American primacy and to use all available instruments, military alliances, economic sanctions, information operations, democracy promotion, to achieve these ends. This is not an entirely wrong analysis. It is also not entirely right. American power is neither as unified nor as purposeful as Moscow's framework requires. It is contested internally, subject to electoral cycles, and genuinely uncertain about its own role in an increasingly multipolar world. What is clear is that Russia's century-long engagement with American power has produced a strategic culture of deep suspicion, a conviction that strength alone commands respect, and a willingness to absorb enormous costs in the service of great power status. Whether that culture produces security or catastrophe, for Russia, for its neighbors, and for the world, remains the central question of our time.